There was no topsoil left. It was down to subsoil. So when we tried to start farming on it, we couldn't get stuff to grow. I really remember green beans that just got to a certain point and would just turn yellow. And we didn't know what was going on, so we had a neighbor come over and take a look. And he dug down about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches, and found a thick white chemical hardpan that roots could not get through.
Welcome to the 321st installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, regenerative agriculture, community food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. I'm recording this podcast a few days before Halloween. So how about a little ghost town story to get us started? In a previous life, while I was a reporter covering outdoor issues for a newspaper, I accompanied a group of coon hunters one night as they chased their hounds in the Whitewater River Valley, which is located in the Driftless region of southeastern Minnesota. At the end of the hunt, we parted ways and I promptly got lost. I drove around and around on back roads in the inky blackness, looking for any kind of landmark that would tell me where I was. By the way, this was before GPS or smartphone mapping apps existed. Finally, I pulled up on a small country cemetery. It turned out it's just about all that's left of the abandoned town of Beaver, an infamous footnote in soil conservation history. The town was founded in the mid-1850s, and after the surrounding hillsides were stripped of their trees and grass, plowed up, and planted to crops, the Whitewater River became uncontrollable due to all of the runoff that resulted. One year alone, the town was swamped more than 24 times by waters carrying soil loosened from the surrounding hills. Finally, less than a century after Beaver's first house was built, the flooding, silt, and mudslides won. The community was abandoned, and it became known as the buried town of Beaver. Well, I obviously made it out of the Whitewater River Valley alive that night. As it turns out, some 3 decades later, I found myself just a few miles from there on the ridgetop vegetable operation of Sandy and Lonnie Dietz. Given the area's soil erosion history, perhaps it's not surprising that taking care of the land was top on Sandy and Lonnie's mind when they started raising vegetables in 1996. Before they bought the farm, its soil had suffered as a result of intense corn and soybean cropping practices and lack of good biological activity. In fact, the soil was so poor, they had difficulty growing anything at first. Over the years, the farmers have used mulching and cover crops to build back their soil's organic matter and to prevent severe erosion. However, one thing that's always concerned Sandy and Lonnie was how much their organic vegetable production system relies heavily on tillage to control weeds. Such constant disturbance can be bad news not only when it comes to erosion, but also in terms of the soil's biological health and its aggregate structure. Through connections made via, among other things, the Land Stewardship Project's Soil Builders Network, the Dietzes learned about various ways to raise food without utilizing intense tillage. However, while no-till systems are pretty well established in conventional corn and soybean enterprises that can utilize chemicals to control weeds, it can be exceedingly difficult to keep weeds at bay in an organic system without disturbing the soil. As a result, Lonnie and Sandy's Whitewater Gardens Farm has gotten funding from the USDA's Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Initiative to study 3 different kinds of no-till vegetable production methods. Of course, one goal of this research is to determine which method best prevents erosion. But the Dietzes are also focused on finding a method that goes beyond the surface and helps build the soil biome, helping create fields that are resilient long into the future. One thing they've learned over the past 3 decades is that keeping soil in place is not enough. It's also critical to make sure there's good biological activity taking place in the underworld. That's why they're integrating extensive soil testing into the research project to measure what impact various no-till systems are having on the land's biology. Whitewater Gardens Farm recently hosted a field day where Sandy and Lonnie showed participants what they're testing and talked about some preliminary results. A few days after the field day, I returned to the Whitewater River Valley, this time in broad daylight, to talk to the farmers about their goal of building soil profitably on a vegetable operation, and why it's important to dig past the surface when doing research. Sandy started our conversation by describing the sorry state of their farm's soil when they moved to the land over 30 years ago.
It had at one point been a dairy farm and was taken care of very well. The fields are fairly, most of the fields are fairly steep, and they had strips. They did probably a traditional 5-year rotation. That included small grains and hay, and it was taken care of very well. But then they sold the farm, and the person that farmed it after that just went straight fence row to fence row, corn and beans. And if a gully opened up, he just closed it and farmed right over it again. The soil had all washed down into the ravine, burying fences, and there was no topsoil left. It was down to subsoil. So even though when we purchased the farm, it had been in 10 years set aside for more than 10 years, it was just planted to brome grass, and it really didn't do anything. It saved the soil from eroding more, but it didn't do anything to build any soil back. So when we tried to start farming on it, we couldn't get stuff to grow. I really remember green beans that just got to a certain point and would just turn yellow. And we didn't know what was going on, so we had a neighbor come over and take a look, and he dug down about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches, and found a thick white chemical hardpan that roots could not get through.
So what did you do? How did you try to build that soil, or what were some of the things that you tried to do?
We started out with small areas. At that point, we did a lot of mulching, not necessarily with hay. It was, mow the lawn, throw the grass on it, threw some cover crops in there. Eventually, getting more activity back in the soil broke through or dissolved that hardpan and started building the soil. We only had about a 1% organic matter at the time, and we gradually built it up to around 3, which isn't really high, but we were taking quite a bit of crop off of it at the time. So definitely in better shape than it had been.
Yeah. I think that would be shocking to a lot of people who think, well, if it was in set-aside and there was a perennial grass being grown there, that soil's going to recover, but it takes more than that, doesn't it?
It definitely takes more than that, and when people say it takes 100 years or how many years to build an inch of topsoil, that's how long it's going to take with a grass like that. But I do believe if you're proactive about it with cover crops and things like that, you can build soil very quickly.
The reason that story really struck with me was I know we're within a few miles of the abandoned town of Beaver, Minnesota, and I find that story, it's kind of a infamous story in the history of soil erosion, in that it's a town that was literally had to be abandoned and moved because of, I guess, was it in the 30s, the severe soil erosion? Is that when it was? Do you remember, Lonnie?
Yeah, I think it was about 1933 that the town had flooded 28 times in one summer. And that's pretty much when the people started moving out. There are stories of people that went to school down there, and there were 12 steps to get up to the school when they started. When they graduated, there were only 2 or 3 left. And when we bought this farm, Sandy mentioned some of the erosion, some of the problems. And there's a 5-foot wire fence going down one lane, and I remember going through that, and all of a sudden the top of the fence posts were below my knees. So there's that much soil that had washed down in that area and covered that. So we had put in 2 diversion ponds too when we bought this to keep the water up on the farm instead of letting everything go down. So we had implemented things like that. And it's interesting when you do a diversion pond, all of a sudden the next year you have frogs in there and you have the aqua life that there was no water around the area, and it's just there. So it's nice.
I guess both with your farm and with the land in general, it can recover if you give it a chance.
It can recover, and what's interesting now is both those diversion ponds basically have very little water in them right now, but they're surrounded with ground cover. So they don't have as much runoff. They're fairly small drainage areas, and there's not as much runoff going in them anymore because we try to keep perennial grasses around them, or the crops that are grown around are grown with more thought in mind to keeping the soil up, or the water up there.
I mean, it must be a really important reminder sometimes of that, to remember that it can get that bad. I mean, we are seeing better conservation practices in this area here, but wow, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. And, sometimes you do see some like fence row to fence row planting, and and you can see that little bit of erosion, but then you can get these big storms, that kind of thing.
Well, and right now too, you're seeing a lot of the conservation practices are being removed because the equipment is getting bigger and bigger. So they're taking out the fence rows so they can just make one field instead of 2 or 3 fields. And they figure that the new equipment that they have now is better than the old equipment. They're not doing the moldboard plowing and stuff like that. So it is better, but you still have a lot of erosion with the larger fields.
One of the things you had looked into, and I think part of this was maybe inspired by your concern about just how bad a shape the farm was in when you first started raising vegetables here and first started farming it, was this idea of you got interested in no-till vegetable production. That's kind of something that you don't see a whole lot. There is often a lot of tillage associated with vegetable production, particularly organic vegetable production. So maybe talk a little bit about why you were interested in looking into no-till vegetable production and when you started, what were some of the things you started looking at with that?
I think just hearing some people talk about what they were doing to build their soil back up. I started getting interested in the soil biology and what that entailed and how to grow that soil biology. But what was happening with us on the farm, we were doing what most organic farms had done, a lot of cultivation, that type of thing. But we found, given the state of the land still at the time, being we're on super heavy clay, it takes a long time to build, and given the strange weather patterns, especially when we were in wet periods, we'd end up farming some fields that should have been put in cover crop, but we had to change our plans because of weather for whatever reason, and some of our soils started going downhill again. And that creates that cycle of the crop not producing well, so then you try to grow more and that type of thing. But when I started getting interested in soil biology, and probably when I started hearing different people talking, not on vegetables, but on crops and grazing and things like that, and then agreed to go on to the Soil Health Steering Committee with LSP, I started hearing more and more stories from some of the other farmers that were grazing or doing regular crops. And I got really excited about the possibility of what you could do to build the soil. So then I started looking into no-till or minimal till with vegetables. And there's a few books out there from some people who have been doing it. But I wasn't, some of the methods to me seemed either difficult or maybe long-term not real sustainable. Just kind of up in the air on what we should try to do here. And that had given me the idea of trying to do some side-by-side research on what might work best for us.
And so my understanding is this is a research funded through the Sustainable Ag and Research and Education Program. So describe kind of what the treatments are. I think there's 3 treatments you're kind of looking at, and kind of describe what you actually are looking at with this.
Okay, we do have 3 treatments as well as a control. We have 12 beds, so there's 3 repetitions of each treatment. The one treatment is a deep compost mulch, which a lot of farms seem to be going to. Another one is what we're calling cut and carry mulch, but basically using a hay or straw mulch on the crop. And then the third one that really intrigued me was a living mulch, where you plant into like a Dutch white clover or something like that. And I've seen people do or have grant projects on some of the individual treatments, but some of the things that they weren't paying attention to as much were the soil biology, what was changing in the soil biology. And I saw an awful lot of so much soil testing and constantly changing the soil test or the soils, with additions and things like that, which to me is a little bit worrisome too, because it takes time when you add amendments for those amendments to work. So I wish the project was longer than a 2-year project, because I know some of the results won't really show themselves for a couple more years. but we're hoping to see which treatment ultimately I think gives the best biological activity, which would in the end hopefully give us the best nutritional quality for the crop.
So not just trying to prevent that erosion, but really to try to build that biology at the same time.
Build the biology, which in turn builds the soil, which in turn would give you a better crop. But we're also looking at how much labor is involved with each of the treatments, what it does with soil temperature, how the pests react to it. We wanted to go further as far as, testing for nutritional quality on the crops, but you had to cut it off somewhere.
So just backing up a little bit, the deep compost mulch, the first treatment you described, is that it was called? What, is that how it sounds? You're just putting a lot of compost on the rows there? Is that what is it just how it sounds?
That's basically what it is. You use about 6 inches of compost, partially to mulch down weeds. And I think that's probably the biggest part of it is to keep weed pressure down, but you're also feeding soil when you're doing that. I think a lot is dependent on the mulch you use. Each one of the treatments I have some concerns with. My concern with the deep compost mulch is ultimately having imbalances in the soil. Too much of some mineral or maybe even skewing the biology more one direction than another.
With the cover crop, what you were using, was it Dutch white clover? Is that what you were using for that?
For the living mulch, we're using Dutch white clover, which this year didn't work out well because we couldn't get it to germinate without rain, and we don't have overhead irrigation. So we're using drip irrigation. We only had one line per bed. It wasn't enough. We put a oat nurse crop on it, and we got a few oats to come up along the drip line, but until it rained, the oats didn't even want to come.
Right. And now we're just as I drove down here, the first frost of the year, so
Right.
that kind of puts an end to maybe getting stuff established, but this time of year.
I'm hoping that the Dutch white clover seed will overwinter okay and then germinate in the spring. I want to see if it germinates. I'm a little bit concerned. If it doesn't, then we can't really use that data very well, but I could add more seed, but then if it does germinate, then we might have too heavy of a crop of clover, and it might skew our crops a bit too, so.
Yeah, that's all part of the research, the joys of research. Well, so I know this is the first year, and it's too early to tell, and this has been an unusually hot, dry year. So it's not a typical year in any way, shape, or form, but were there some things you were able to observe that first year that you're like, well, okay, this is something to keep in mind about using no-till systems like this, and some lessons learned maybe going into the future?
One of the biggest differences was between the control and the two mulched, the deep compost mulch and the cut and carry mulch. Those mulched areas are probably twice the size. The crops are probably twice the size of the control and the living mulch that didn't germinate. So that's acting quite a bit like the control. That was a huge difference there. I think soil temperature, I noticed, was hugely different with the open ground with such a hot, dry year, down about 3 inches. That soil temperature was just about the same temperature as the air temperature. So that's pretty darn hot, especially since our crop this year was cauliflower, fall cauliflower. It was significantly cooler under the cut and carry mulch and a little bit cooler underneath the deep compost mulch. Those were big differences. One thing that we've learned overall when you're doing minimal till or no-till is gophers can be an issue. Without going through and doing a lot of tilling, they're setting up home all over the place, and they actually took probably about a quarter of our crop.
Oh, wow.
So we have to address that issue next year for sure.
With the cut and carry mulch, again, as the name explains, you're cutting it's hay, right? That you're explain what cut and carry. What would that be?
Well, it's actually taking hay that's been, you can purchase it baled or whatever and use it, or you can cut your own and put it down fresh, which some farms are doing. We don't have the equipment for that or anything, so we purchased hay, and I purchased really good alfalfa hay versus straw, which a lot of people like to use, because I feel that the alfalfa hay is going to add some nutrition to the soil. And we were careful that it was real good quality hay without weeds. I think there is the idea out there that straw, you're not going to get the weed pressure. We've used straw mulch that had too much oats that had matured into it and had a huge oat crop from it. Or you can have just as many weeds in a straw.
Well, and I bring up hay because that's an issue in a drought year. Hay's so expensive because I know you're looking at the economics and the labor based on related to this. That's got to be a big thing to keep in mind too. Is like, well, it may work really well, but if it's not going to be economically viable, then that's not going to work in the long term.
Right, that is part of it. I'm trying to look at it as, we're not adding any additional fertilizer to anything. So I'm looking at that hay as additional fertilizer. That's one of the reasons that I used alfalfa. And in the long run, hopefully, the increased biology will make nutrients more available to the crop versus having it open.
Well, I know one of the things, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but you're not just looking at trying to figure out the best way to cover that ground and keep it protected, but you're really looking at the soil health. And I know one of the things you did as part of this research project was did some deep analysis of that soil through like the Haney test and that kind of thing?
We had, instead of just having a regular soil test done, which we had that done too, but we had a Haney test done in addition. And we also had a soil food web test done to take a look at the soil or the biological activity at the beginning, and then we'll do that at the end of the grant, at the end of the 2 years, and we'll see if there's a change in that activity.
Tell me more about why that, not just doing a regular soil test, felt like you need to go beyond, and what is it you're actually looking at with the soil food web test and the Haney test that maybe you wouldn't get normally through the other tests?
Well, I think the availability of those nutrients in the soil, those minerals in the soil, is largely dependent on that biological activity. Mm-hmm. The Haney test takes that into consideration, and then the soil food web test take a closer look at what those fungi, bacteria, nematode, all those counts are. I wish we had been able to do it sooner, but we also participated in a 100 Farms project with the University of Minnesota. And the day after the field day, we got results, the biological results from that. And it wasn't those fields. I wish we could have done it on those fields. It was on our greenhouse, two of the greenhouses and one other field. And they even took a deeper dive into what is happening with those soils, and it's fascinating. I would love to do that with the grant project, but without probably another grant, I wouldn't be able to afford to have all that testing done.
Yeah. I find this research fascinating because you're kind of coming up with some things that maybe people wouldn't think of off the top of their head. And one of them was, you said the temperature, there was a big difference in the temperature, which is particularly important in a year like this where it was so hot and dry. But the other things, I think, Lonnie, you mentioned this, and I was surprised to hear this, but you felt like the compost water, when rain did come, it was hitting that and kind of creating a little bit of a crust, and it was shedding the water rather than letting it kind of soak in. I was a little bit surprised at that, and I think that's something to consider when doing something. Anything you do, there's going to be an impact, maybe some unforeseen circumstances.
That was something that we looked at the other day, and also with the compost, deep bed compost on top, you're not covering it up, so a lot of the nitrogen is allowed to go off into the air, so you're not getting full benefit from the compost without covering it. But also, it was a fine enough mesh that the water did run off to the side, so I was finding when I was doing the penetrometer, so that was part of our test too, to see where the hard pan was and how dry the soil was. It was actually pushing down harder in the compost area than would in the cut and carry area. or even the open area. So you could tell that the water was being shed off. Now, there was moisture under the compost, so it was holding some moisture there, but there was quite a bit at surface level, but down deeper it wasn't penetrating as much. So that was one of the things that we noticed in that, and that could be just this year too, with all the way through July. I think we had about an inch of rain about July 13th, and we didn't have any more rain. August, I think we totaled about 7/10, maybe half inch, and from July 13th all the way to September 13th. So we went 2 months with really virtually no rain at all to penetrate anything. So it's kind of an unusual year to test these things. Now, different mulches, different deep bed mulches could act differently too. Now, we do use a vegetative mulch. We're staying away from the animal mulch because you can, without really having it tested, that's where you can really run into nutrient issues with high phosphorus or something like that.
Right.
So we're staying with the vegetative and not the animal compost. It's possible that the animal compost might have more activity. We've noticed more fungal activity with cut and carry mulch too on the surface level. You could see a lot of mycorrhizal, where with the dry compost there was nothing at the surface level underneath the mulch. That again could change if you had the animal compost.
You know, you've been here 30 years. You've always taken efforts to kind of rebuild that soil and bring it back. That this research maybe is that next step. It sounds like it's kind of fun, maybe a little bit fun for you to kind of figure out.
I do
what's
love
figuring out?
working. I do love working with that. It's I've become kind of obsessed with it. But if it's not fun, why do it, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's also kind of that whole idea of farmer-to-farmer education, and that's what is great about programs like the SARE program, is it does allow you to, and I know you had a field day the other day, and a couple farmers came down who are vegetable producers, and we're able to kind of see what you were doing there a little bit. But it's it just kind of shows that you kind of came here and probably were a little bit surprised at how poor the soil was, but were able to make it into a productive vegetable operation. But now you're able to say, well, that's not enough. And that's the whole idea behind regenerative or sustainable ag. It's kind of a continuum. You're never really done, are you?
Oh, no, there's still so much that we don't know. We tend to think that we know a lot about it, but we're always discovering something new. And it was so interesting that somebody mentioned at the field day too, you know, there's so many more things that we could take a look at. The soil food web tests are done through Elaine Ingham's work, and she focuses on the microbiology, whereas, you know, what about the macrobiology? What about the beetles and the mites and the worms and things like that are coming back? You could do counts on that. There's so many different directions that you could research here, and they really felt that we should see if we could somehow try to continue this afterwards, whether it would be getting another grant. I want to continue it to a point. I just wouldn't be able to do all of the testing. So most of it would be just observation at that point. But if I could get funding afterwards, it would be fascinating. And I've got a daughter that is really into nutritional health and everything, and she would love us to be able to test if there's nutritional differences in the different treatments too.
The whole world of soil health, the thing I've found most exciting about it is often the farmers are leading a lot of the work on that. They're observing things, but maybe not sure why they're observing things. So it's been interesting to see them team up with scientists and agronomists and try to figure out, well, why are we seeing some of these impacts and that kind of thing. And I think the possibilities are boundless in some ways.
They definitely are endless, and I've been encouraged to see some of the agencies in the area getting more and more interested in soil health. And granted, we're focusing on vegetables, but I think we need to focus more on the larger crops. I know we're dependent on the corn and soybeans, but I think we can do it better. And I know there's a lot of no-till out there, but there's no-till that works and there's no-till that doesn't work. And we've got a real good example close by of a farm that's been in no-till as long as we've been here, but there is so much real erosion underneath, and it takes years for anything to decompose in there. So that is a good example of no-till that isn't working.
Yeah, that's a super good example of you are protecting the surface, but you're not getting at the biology and the down deeper. You're not building that aggregate structure maybe as well and building the actual biological health.
Right, there's still the erosion there, but people don't see it because you have that residue on the top. But that residue, if it's a good, healthy biological soil, should break down in a year. I've seen residue from, 2 years previous on some of that. So, getting the other legs of the stool involved, like getting the cover crops in there, however you burn it down or knock it down or whatever, and getting the diversity in there are there really huge legs to that no-till situation. And I see people doing it, and I see them having success with it. Some years might not be so good, but it's going to take time for us to get it down.
Yeah, I think you said earlier, you don't believe in immediate results.
It doesn't happen. I'm amazed at how quickly we can build soil if we really try. But I think we have to be a little bit careful about how we're doing it too. And I think, it's kind of cliche to say working with nature or mimicking nature or whatever. But you do have to see what nature is doing, and you can speed it up a little bit, but you have to be careful not to overdo it, because you can create other imbalances.
I think Sandy, when she joined the soil team for LSP, realized how much some of the so-called conventional farms are doing in this area to create soil health and regenerative. And you see the corporations are pushing that more and more for regenerative type farming. So it is moving that direction. A lot of farms are caught up, and that's probably why we started going backwards a little bit too. Even organic is just another technique of farming, and that's the farming that we chose to do, just for the nutritional reasons and reasons that we believe in. But that's a technique, and conventional is technique. But you get caught up when you're not quite making ends meet at the end of the year. You say, well, what can we do? Well, we need to get a little bit bigger. That's the mindset of the farms.
Right.
So you keep trying to get a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and all of a sudden you're not taking care of the little things as much as you should. And it's not working out. So you see the soil go backwards like we did. And now we're just turning around. We're at the point where we can turn around and start looking back at that again.
For more information on building soil health profitably and the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, see the podcast page for Ear to the Ground episode 321 at landstewardshipproject.org. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org, or you can call 612-816-9342. By the way, it helps us greatly if you can give Ear to the Ground a rating on whatever podcast platform you utilize. And word of mouth is the best way to spread the word on our podcast. If you like what you hear, tell at least one person about LSP's Ear to the Ground. Thanks to Laura Borgendale, a Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.